Hello, everyone. Today we are getting much closer to the end of our M4 lessons, and we are talking about this is our first of 2 weeks of discussing conjunctions. And when we say conjunctions, we're speaking loosely about referring to things that come in between two different clauses. A clause being a verb and possibly a subject. But knowing Japanese, often that subject or topic is dropped out, it's invisible. But talking about the relationship between two actions or between two states. And we've got two that we're going to talk about today. The first is to, which we've seen how many times now? Too many. To is the overloaded particle that does just about everything in Japanese. And we're going to look at two more things that it does. One that's more common. The second one is much rarer, but it still happens from time to time. But let's go ahead and jump into that. Now, we've talked about the usage of to in between nouns primarily. We say ramen to kare, to describe a noun and another noun. Today, we are not talking about and at all. Again, we're talking about the relationship between two clauses. And so the first one, I'm going to keep just passing through these. The first one describes kind of a causal relationship. And if you haven't heard the word causal before, it's related to cause, as in cause and effect. It's showing that the first action or the first clause causes or is the reason for the second one happening. And, we've seen a lot of things like this. For example, kara and node, we've covered up until now. To is slightly different. It sometimes gets translated as when as well, not just the if then. But the important thing to note is that it shows a natural or expected relationship between the two things. Like if A happens, then B happens. And B happening because of A is something that most everyone will agree with. Yeah, that's what happens. That's what we mean when we say natural. It's an expected relationship between those two things. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. We've got a couple sentences to look at. And the first one is, よく勉強すると成績が上がる. Now, most people would agree with that. It's not a 100% thing. That's not what we're talking about today. But the first clause is study hard, or in our if-then construct, if you study hard, your grades will go up or rise, if we're being overly literal with the translation. If you study hard, your grades will go up. Now, sometimes I see this translated as when you study hard, your grades will go up. And, that when is not referring to a specific time. When I say when, I don't mean that Thursday when you studied or when you will study. It's a general, when this action happens, the second action happens. And so you see it translated in both ways. You see an if then, or you might see a when. Now, in both of those cases, we're talking about, things that may or may not have happened. That's what we're saying if. Let's take a look at the next sentence. 寒いと外に出る人があまりいない. Now this one's interesting because usually when we think of clauses, we think of actions, like I said earlier. And that's typically the most common thing you see is an action. However, a clause is a technical way of saying kind of the bones of a sentence. And when we think of all the different ways we can have sentences, they're not just actions. It's not this sentence needs an action. You can say, I am cold, or today is hot, or it is 3 o'clock. And these are all, they come with, in polite Japanese, nouns and adjectives will have a des on the end of it. And in more casual Japanese or short form Japanese, you'll often see that dropped, or the des replaced with a da. And as we've talked about before, often when we're dealing with grammar that's kind of inside of the sentence, it's not sentence ending grammar, but it's in the first clause of two clauses, we often use the short form, or what we call the casual form, sometimes plain form. And so here, you see samui and you think, well, that's just a word. But it's not actually a word. There's actually an entire sentence there, and it's just been chopped down a bit. You know, if you were to take that out and put it by itself, it would probably be samui desu. Or if we were speaking casually, we'd say samui. And hey, there, a single word is a sentence. And of course, in that case, it's implied that the subject is the weather, because samui can only refer to the air temperature. So we have an actual sentence there. It just looks like a lot less. So when it's cold, there aren't many people going outside. 寒いと外に出る人があまりいない。And as I noted, these are natural things. You know, it's a natural expectation, not natural in the nature sense, but just as in this is a common effect due to this cause. You know, you study. No, you can study, and your grades won't go up. That's possible, of course. But generally speaking, when you study hard or you study a lot, your grades do get better. And when it's cold outside, there are less people that are heading out. So these are both, you know, expected things. Now, you can also think of it, this is a slightly different way of describing it. We were talking kind of about theoretical that may have happened or may happen in the future. You can also talk about things that might happen multiple times, or every time that this first thing happens, the second thing also happens. So let's take a look at these two examples. Again, here we have this clause that doesn't look like a sentence, but it actually is. Yasumi da to. So yasumi da, there's your clause. Yasumi da to, kono michi wa kondeiru. So whenever it's a holiday, and we're not talking about if it's a holiday, because that almost sounds like, you know, there may not be a holiday in the future, but if there is, then this happens. The whenever translation sounds a bit better because we're talking about something that continues to happen. You know, there's holidays all the time. Yasumi da to kono michi wa kondeiru. So what kind of street are we talking about? I'm picturing a street that has, you know, car traffic closed off, or maybe not, but there's a bunch of smaller shops lining the streets, and maybe it's in a tourist area. So when it's a holiday, lots of people come out, and it's busy, it's crowded. Similarly, we're talking about something that, you know, hopefully this is something that happens, you know, often with the student. 先生に手伝ってもらうともっと頑張りたくなる. So when the teacher helps me, I want to try even harder. You know, you're getting that recognition from the teacher, that acknowledgement, and because the teacher's helping you, you're like, okay, I wanna try even more. So these are just a few more examples of showing that natural connection. And natural does not mean that it's guaranteed 100%, like this is always going to happen. It's generally accepted that this is what's going to happen, or it happens quite frequently. You know, you can think of it in slightly different ways. Now, let me jump back real fast. So take a look at these four first clauses. We have benkyou suru. I'm kind of overemphasizing that last one. Benkyou suru. And we have deru. Sorry, no, that's the first clause is samui. We've got yasumi da, and then we've got tetsudatte morau. Do you see anything that's linking these four clauses together? I'll type them out in the channel so you can see it, so you can think about it. Is there anything you notice, a similarity between those four things? I'll give you a hint. It has to do with the conjugation. Do you see anything with the conjugation that makes you think, oh, these are all something that's similar between all of them. Any ideas? We have a rather small group today. It's probably due to, I'm guessing, daylight savings time and my refusal to switch the event times over because it's a really good time for me in the morning to have it now. But I'll live with it. I'll live with the small numbers. So it doesn't have to do with the particles, and there's no te form in there. But let me ask you this. What tense are all those in? There's a good hint. When are these things happening? They're all in the plain form. Well, they're all in the plain form because they come in the first, they come before this conjunction. But they're all in the non-past is what I was looking for. And remember, we've talked about this before, but it's one of those weird things with Japanese, so it's worth mentioning. There's no such thing as the future tense in Japanese. There's only two real tenses. There's past tense and there's not past tense. We know what past tense looks like. Non-past is the thing we use for present, for the now, as well as for anything that happens in the future. And all of these are in the non-past tense. So the four examples we gave you were, when you study hard, your grades go up. This isn't referring to any specific time or place. We don't know if it's in the past. People have had their grades go up in the past because they studied. They could be doing it now. They could be doing it in the future. Same with things being cold, with it being a holiday, or when the teacher helps you. These are all things that could happen at any point in time. However, it is possible to have a full sentence in the past tense. Let's take a look at this. It might be a bit confusing at first, but we're going to work all the way through it. So here we see two different tenses going on. We have ao, which is just like all the ones we had before. This is in the non-past form. Then we have the sentence ending in the past tense. So here's the rule. Whatever comes before to needs to be in the non-past. We cannot have a past tense form. Because let me talk about the meaning of this, and then we'll talk about that in just a sec. その人に会うといつも喧嘩した. So maybe you were a bit of a fighter when you were younger, earlier in your life. And whenever you saw that person, whenever you met that person, whenever you ran into them, you'd fight with them. Kenka doesn't necessarily mean punches are being thrown. It could just be you barking at each other, literally, or using, fighting words. But, so what's happening here? When are these fights happening? These fights or arguments, or whatever you want to call it, this is all happening in the past. Remember, this is a general rule that works out really well. Whenever you have a more complicated sentence in Japanese, and you have, this is not past tense, this is past tense. Wait, what's going on here? The last verb, the verb that comes at the end of the sentence, is telling you when the whole thing happened. And so in this case, the kenka shita, that shita there on the back end, is letting you know, this is something that happened in the past. Now, we were just talking about to does two things. It has that natural link between the cause and effect. It also has that whenever sense to it. Like every time this happened, this other thing happened. And so it could be something that happened multiple times, but this is all in the past. Maybe now you're best friends. Maybe now you're married. But if you're married, you probably wouldn't say sono hito. But, let's put that aside. So here we're saying every time I run into that person, I got in a fight with them. So instead of just saying before the to, you should use the non-past, let's actually look at why it's non-past. The reason for that is, let's think about these two things happening. You see the person, you meet the person, and then you get into a fight. First thing's the meeting, next thing's the fighting. Now, when you meet them, the meeting is happening right then, right? You say, "Oh, I see you. Let's fight." The meeting them hasn't ended yet. You when you are done seeing someone, you know, you leave. You're like, "Oh, okay, see you, bye." So the fighting starting to happen is when that first action happens, when it begins. And so it would make sense to say after I met the person, in the sense of, after I was done meeting them, I get into a fight. You use that to say this first action has to happen first. So it's not done yet. It happens, and then the second thing happens. Because it needs to happen first, we're going to keep it in the non-past tense. Now, there's a couple more things to keep in mind. This isn't a rule. It's just something that commonly happens. But let's take a look at this one. 友達が行くと寂しくなる. So here we've got when my friends go. When you say go, that speaks of someone or something going away from the speaker, unless it's the speaker talking about themselves. So it sounds like they're going home or they're going somewhere. When my friends go, I get lonely. Or my friends leave, I get lonely. Now, this would not make much sense if we did this. I'm going to copy and paste this into the Discord. When my friends leave, I am lonely. Even saying that in English might make your ears pop up a little bit and say, there's something a little wrong with that. Because you don't say, I am lonely. The thing that's happening there is there's a change. Presumably, you weren't lonely when your friends were there. You became lonely. There was a change, a cause. A cause has an effect. An effect isn't, I am lonely. The effect is, I became lonely or I'm becoming lonely. So often when you have the, an adjective on the end, whether it's an e adjective or a na adjective, you're going to have naru there to help show and emphasize that some change is taking place because of the first action. Now, this is a relatively common way of using this grammar. However, there is one more usage that I feel is rather rare, but in the goal of inclusion, getting all the usages in there, let's talk about it just a little bit. So there's one more way that you can use this, and it's used to show more of a sequential set of events, like this happens and then this happens, and they don't have to be cause-effect. There doesn't have to be a causal relationship between the two. Now, again, I really don't see this that often, but it comes up from time to time. So a couple of quick examples, then we'll be done with this. So the first one, let's look at it. 本を読むと電話が鳴った. So this one almost shows an overlay between them, but there is kind of a sequence. Not necessarily in the sense of, you read the book and then you finish the book. It could be that you're reading the book. But 本を読むと, when I read the book or I was reading a book and the phone rang. Now note that there is no progressive tense in here. There's no yonde iru, but it can be understood and translated that way, because when did the phone ring? Well, the phone rang when I was reading the book. Now the second one, and again, just like before, we have a difference. This whole thing happened in the past. I was reading a book and the phone rang. But everything that comes before the to needs to be in that non-past because it hasn't happened yet relative to the second action. One more example. 散歩するとカフェに行く. Now, this is different from before because these are not natural links between the two. No one would say, oh, of course, reading the book causes friends to call you or causes someone to call you. You might feel like that's the way of the universe playing tricks on you when you get into a book just to have a phone ring, but it's not a natural occurrence. There's no relationship between the two. It might feel like that way, but that's not the case. The second one you might argue, well, I tend to walk by insert name of, cafe. And so I go there because I walk by and I see it and I think I need that caffeine and you walk in. But that's not really a natural, um, relationship, nor is it an every time thing. So this is just a sequence of events that's taking place. Now, let's go to the second one, which I feel is really important to look at because there's a lot of confusion that comes in with this one. Now, we've seen this one before. We've seen noni before. And we talked about it in the sense of however, but just as a quick review so we can draw a bit more contrast between the one we learned and the one we're doing today. Let's talk about the old noni a little bit more. Now noni, like the one we're doing today and the one that we did before, noni is working, it's a conjunction. It works between two clauses. And it does mean A, so A happened, however B. However, it doesn't just mean however. Like if it just meant however, it could be the same as these. Ga or kedo or keredo. Those just show a contrast between the first and the second thing. With noni, however, it's not just showing a contrast. It's actually showing a contrast, and on top of that, it's showing the speaker's, I'm going to say, disapproval or disappointment or being upset or some kind of negative feeling towards that contrast. And we're gonna let Renshu help us out with this. So I'm gonna pop this little Kalchan pop this out for us because it's not actually in it's actually in the oh, you know what? I apologize because I've got a special kanji setting on right now, which is going to make things all the kanji appear in a strange way. I apologize for that. So yeah, and I'm not gonna have time to fix that now. I'm gonna retype this out real fast. There's an example up there, but let me type it out in more sane. Okay. Apologies for those settings. Here we go. おじいちゃん、せちゃんや。おじいちゃんはすごく元気なのに、人の前で病気のふりをする. I believe furiosuru is one that we learned just recently, but it means to act or to pretend. So even though despite Grandpa being good, being Genki, Genki is that catch-all for good, in good spirits, healthy, however you want to say it, doing well. In front of other people, he acts sick. So we have this contrast between these two things. You wouldn't expect the second thing to happen given the first clause. So there's a however. But at the same time, using noni, the speaker is saying, I don't like that this is happening. I disapprove of this in some sense or form. And this is the noni that we tend to see more often than not. However, the one that we're learning today does come up. And it comes up more than you think. It just, when you hear it, the good thing is when you hear this one and you hear the other one, it's immediately obvious once you have a grasp on them, which is which. There's no ambiguity whatsoever. With this one, it's actually meaning in order to. And we're going to look at some examples, and I'm going to step back and show you a different way to think about this. But first, let's look at a couple of quick examples. For example, tazuneru no ni, in order to visit. Or kayo no ni, in order to commute. And kayo can be work, it can also be going to school. And, in order to do something, let's think about what will come after that. So we're saying in order to visit someone or something, or in order to commute to work or to school. We're going to need to show something afterwards that is required for that action to take place. So we're talking about requirements. We're talking about essentials. And so often it shows an action that needs to take place. You know, in order to go to school, you know, I need to ride my bike. Or, and that might be the sentence coming up, I'm not sure. In order to visit them, I need to buy a ticket. It might talk about an action. It might talk about time. You know, it costs money. It takes this much time. But we're showing something that is required for this first thing to take place. So let's take a look at a few examples. おばあさんに尋ねるのに飛行機に乗る. In order to visit my grandmother, I take a plane, or I ride a plane. I get on a plane. One more. 大学に通うのに1時間以上かかる. So this is, you know, you can see it translated different ways. Noni is one of those ones where there's not a fixed translation. You might say, and let me go back to the original translation we had. In order to go to university, it takes over an hour. But you know what? That doesn't sound quite as natural as it could be. So you might say the process of commuting to the college takes over an hour. And you say, oh, yeah, that works. That works. I might use that. You might also just say it takes over an hour to commute to the college. And just that too. You know, I study hard to get a good grade. And that too encapsulates the noni meaning. Now, what's interesting here is previously, so let's look up, and you can still see, if you're looking at the video or if you're here in Discord with us now, you can see previously the noni we kind of thought of as a word. Like, no, what's this conjunction? The conjunction is noni. However, the one we're learning today, that's not actually the case, or at least I feel that it's easier to think of it slightly differently. Instead of thinking of noni, we're thinking of no and ni. So let me take the first sentence. Let me drop it in there. So there we go. I broke it up, separating the no and the ni. So remember, what does the no do when you put it behind a verb? Anyone? Anyone in the Discord remember? What happens to a verb when we throw a no behind it? It changes it, but what does it change it into? I see a couple. It nominalizes, which I love. I love that word, but if you don't know what that word means, you get the definition right below. It becomes a noun. So here we have おばあさんに尋ねるの. So going or visiting my grandmother. Going to see my grandmother, visiting my grandmother. There's your noun. Now, ni has a ton of usages, but one of the most common usages is to show, you know, the destination. And I like to think of it that way. So we have this action, and that's our destination. Or let's put it another way, that's our goal. So going to grandmother's or going to visit grandmother is our goal. To get there, you know, usually we use ni and then we have a movement action. We say like iku, you know, gakko ni iku. However, here I feel like that second action it's the iku, it's the going. But we're using that to get to that first clause. So that's our goal. It's our noun, going to grandmother's. To get there with the ni, we are riding a plane or getting on a plane. Riding a plane makes it sound like you're on top of the plane, which I guess, you know, it might work out for you. So I always think of it that way, and it makes this noni usage much clearer. And it works in the second sentence as well. 大学に通うの. I'm splitting it up. So going to university, that's our goal. To do that, what's happening? an hour, it takes an hour. You need that taking an hour to get to university. And so with that in mind, let's take a look at just two more examples before we wrap up today's lesson. And the page is just letting us know something I already mentioned, that the second thing is required. It's not just something you're doing on the side, it's something that's required for the first thing to take place. Riding or getting on a plane is necessary to visit grandmother. Or it's necessary for it to take over an hour to get to the university. Okay. 日本語の本を読むのに辞書を使った。So, this is something that we've probably all experienced, whether it was a book or a newspaper article or manga or just the subs on the bottom of a movie or drama or whatever. In order to read the Japanese book, I used a dictionary. And because we have this in order, we talked about the need of that second thing in order for the first thing to occur. This is noting, without saying it, that without that dictionary, I would not have read the Japanese book. I needed it. It's not I could have read by myself, but I was using the dictionary to help me out. It's definitely I needed this for this first thing to happen. And the second one, using one of my favorite and abbreviations. There we go. I couldn't think of the word. 上手になるのにいっぱい練習しなきゃ. So in order to get good at something, we say renshu, which makes me think of like a sport or a skill or an activity or a hobby maybe. 上手になるのにいっぱい練習しなきゃ. And just in case you don't remember this one, what's shinakya? It's one of those ones that once you learn it, you can't stop using. So it's just fun to say, shinakya or tabenakya. It's shinakereba naranai. It's one of our numerous, I have to do this. It must be done. But you can take the shinakereba naranai and shorten it down in casual speech to shinakya. So with the second one, again, we're stating that getting good, it's not going to happen unless I practice a lot. At least in the mindset of the person speaking, that's a requirement. So, last note. With English, excuse me, let me back up and look at one more time. Look at this. You have to practice a lot in order to become good at whatever. Or to become good at ... I have to practice a lot. Both of these work in English. You can swap them around. However, in Japanese, it's stricter. The goal, whatever's coming in front of noni, that's coming first. Noni's coming first, and then the required action is coming after that. Those cannot be flipped around. So just keep that in mind. Anyway, that's it for today. We've just got these two. So just as a quick review, we used to describe, more often than not, a natural cause and effect relationship between two things. When it rains, I don't go outside. Or, when it's sunny, lots of people play at the park. It's typically shown for these natural cause and effect relationships. It sometimes is used for sequential actions, but not that often. Noni, on the other hand, is completely unrelated, except for the fact that it comes in between two clauses. Today's noni, is used to show in order to. It shows for the first action to take place, the second action is required. And that's it. I know in your head you probably have about a million different conjunctions to this point, and you're done with them. You're like, I don't need any more. But we have, I believe, two more. before we're done with N4, and we will cover those next week, in next week's lesson. Anyway, don't forget, wherever you're happy to watch this video, or if you're with us live, you can always check these out again if you go into Renshu's menu. And you can't see the menu icon here on the stream, but you can see it popping out right here. You go down to resources and then Japanese lessons, and they're always available inside of there. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you next time. お疲れ様でした。